Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. This is the 18th Annual Acquisition Research Symposium hosted by the Naval Postgraduate School. And this is the panel titled Enhancing Acquisition with Artificial Intelligence and Cybersecurity. So I am the Chief of Naval Research, Rear Admiral Lorin Selby. I lead something called the Naval Research Enterprise, which is comprised of the Office of Naval Research, the Naval Research Laboratory, O&R Global, obviously overseas global presence, and PMR 51. Really happy to come in today to discuss these really important topics. I'm going to start out by introducing our three distinguished speakers. I'm going to say a few remarks, and then I'm going to kick it back to them for their discussions. And then at the end of that, we're going to take questions from you. So please use the Q&A box to put questions in as we go along here, and I'll try to go through those and parse those and try to bring those to the appropriate member or the entire panel at the end of this. So first off, our first presenter today is going to be Dr. Tim Shives. He's with us with his paper titled Acquiring Artificial Intelligence Systems, Development Challenges, Implementation Risks, and Cost-Benefit Opportunities. Dr. Shives is a DoD civil servant in the field of IT management, serving at the Defense Manpower Data Center, and currently on special assignment here at Naval Postgraduate School's Information Sciences Department as a part of the Defense Senior Leadership Development Program, of which we only pick 30 DoD civilians a year for that very distinguished program. So it's a great honor for him to be in that program. While he's doing that there at MPS, he's also working on his PhD in Information Sciences. This will be his second doctorate. He currently holds a Doctor of Education in Educational Leadership from Liberty University. He holds an Education Specialist Postgraduate degree in Educational Leadership from Liberty University, and a Master's of Science degree in Information Technology Management, a Master of Business Administration degree from the Naval Postgraduate School, and one more Master's of Arts in National Security and Strategic Studies from the U.S. Naval War College. It's a pretty impressive list of degrees there. It's fantastic. Dr. Shives is also a Marine Corps officer who is now a part of the reserves. He's got more than 50 years as both a Cobra pilot and working in the world of financial, IT, project acquisition, and data management. Our next panelist will be Dr. Carol Woody, who will be discussing her paper, which is titled Lessons Learned in Building and Implementing an Effective Cybersecurity Strategy. Dr. Woody is a senior member of the technical staff at Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute, where she serves as the technical manager for the cybersecurity engineering team. She has vast experience as a technical researcher for cybersecurity, focusing on government agencies, higher education, and medical organizations. Dr. Woody holds a PhD in Information Science from Nova Southeastern University and an MBA from Wake Forest University, as well as a BS in Mathematics from William & Mary. Our final presenter today will be Mr. Scot Miller with his paper titled Using Interdependence Analysis to Derive Adequate Requirements and Testing for Artificial Intelligence Enabled Critical Functions Within a System. Mr. Miller is a research associate professor here at the Naval Postgraduate School, where he focuses in several areas such as naval network-centric warfare, knowledge management, maritime domain awareness, and AI ML. He's a retired Navy captain with 29 years of service, serving as both an aviator and an information professional officer. He holds a master's or an MBA from the University of West Florida, a Master of Science in Operations Analysis from the Naval Postgraduate School, and a Master's of Arts in National Security and Strategic Studies with distinction from the Naval War College. He also completed the Advanced Program Management course at the Defense Systems Management College. What an impressive panel we got today. So this is going to be a great discussion. So really honored to have all of you here, and really look forward to hearing what you got to say. But first, let me kind of set the stage. So anybody who's heard me speak over the years has heard me kind of talking about where I think we are at a point in kind of history. Technology continues to race ahead at a breakneck pace. And it's been doing that for a long time, granted. But I think we're at a pivotal moment in history. I think we're at a major inflection point. And I think COVID is actually accelerating some of that. And I think other world events are starting to accelerate some of that. I do think that artificial intelligence is a critical part of that. And of course, cybersecurity is also critically important. In fact, I am coming to you today from the Naval Air Station at Oceana, Virginia. So if you hear those jets flying around, that's the sound of freedom outside this window. But I actually got down here yesterday, and I didn't stop to get gas, which was a tactical error because there's a run on gasoline right now in this part of the country. And this is all driven by that cyber attack on the pipeline that's controlling a lot of the southeastern United States oil supplies or gasoline supplies. So fortunately, when I went to Little Creek this morning, I was able to find the pumps there. Although there was a line, I was able to get gas. So I will be able to go home this afternoon, which would be nice. But cybersecurity, nonetheless, is critically important. Brought to the fore yet again by another cyber attack, which is in some respects crippling a part of our infrastructure and our economy. But as I look at the technological shifts that are coming, I've been telling my workforce in the Naval Research enterprise that I think it's time to reimagine naval power. I think it's time to reimagine what the future of naval power could be, probably should be, and then more importantly, how we get there. Now, to get there, we need to have the acquisition system kind of firing all cylinders to help us get there. There are many complaints about the acquisition system that many of us here, those of us that are in acquisition for many, many years. In some respects, they may be off target. I think when we build highly complex things like warships, submarines, aircraft carriers, you need to have a very slow, deliberate process that goes after de-risking a lot of the technologies you want to put on those platforms. But when you're trying to go after things like artificial intelligence or smaller autonomous systems, even what I would call attritable autonomous systems, inexpensive things you're going to use for maybe one time or maybe for a few years, and you're going to dispose of it when you get done. You're going to recycle when you get done. I think the model we have today is not tuned for that. The acquisition model we have today is primarily tuned for the Soviet threat. It's tuned for about 1985, and it's tuned for an adversary that is technologically inferior and economically inferior to us. That is not the case today with a nation like China. You could argue they are at parity with us technologically. Some would say they're ahead in some areas, behind in others, but they're damn close to being at parity. And economically, they are on a pace that will eclipse us sometime soon. So it's a different mindset that we've got to put on this problem. And so I think some of the topics we have today are applicable to that discussion. I think it's a worthy debate that we should be having about what our acquisition system, what it's tuned to do and what it's tuned not to do. And how do you go after those things it's not tuned to do? And I truly believe that we're probably at a position here at a point in time where it is time for a reset. And it is time for some structural reforms to our acquisition system to go after these technologies. So it's a pretty robust conversation right now in the OpNav staff and in the halls of ASN RDA's organization, where we're talking about these kind of things right now. What do we want? What's the to-be state for these kind of systems? How do we move these technologies faster? How do we find early adopters, get the warfare fighters involved early, and really move these techs through the pipeline? And that valley of death we all like to talk about. How do we really get across that in a much more effective, efficient, and faster way? So those are some of the things that's kind of in my head. And when you think about things like AI and digital engineering, I think also the model of kind of the Wayne Meyer model of build a little, test a little, learn a lot, I think that also changes. I think this is really an era where with digital engineering, we model, not a little, you model everything, okay? You should model everything. You should then analyze everything in your model and then optimize for whatever the factors you want to optimize for and then build. So it's really model, analyze, optimize, and build. I think that's kind of the new paradigm with digital engineering. And I do think artificial intelligence will be a part of that optimization, no doubt about it. And clearly, we've got to bake cybersecurity into everything we do from the get-go, not try to bolt it on later like we've tended to try to do in the past year. Because, quite frankly, a lot of our systems were developed 20, 30, and more years ago, prior to the time this became a critical concern for us. But anyway, I'm hoping today we can actually get after maybe some of these discussion points and topics in the talk. And with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Shives to start. So, Tim, over to you.
All right. Thank you, sir. Let me get my presentation up. Okay. Well, let's see. Move this out of the way. All right. Thank you for the introduction, sir. And good afternoon, everyone. Again, as the Admiral said, my name is Tim Shives, and my talk is on forecasting risk and DoD Artificial Intelligence Acquisitions. While my colleagues in this panel are going to discuss their research that dives into more technical and sides of artificial intelligence, my discussion is going to focus more on the acquisition program management, some of the stuff that the Admiral talked about, with the emphasis on forecasting and managing risks in DoD AI acquisitions. So the DoD has embarked in this new era of increased acquisition of AI in the past decade. In 2010, two things made AI more viable. We had increased computing power coupled with the growing availability of big data. So as a result, the DoD started developing more AI systems. But it was soon discovering that the fielding of these new advanced technologies, such as AI, is a risky venture for the DoD and the rest of the federal government. In fact, we looked into this research. We pulled up the 2018 Defense Science Board research as well as the 2020 GAO comprehensive study. And it was discovered that DoD acquisition in these software intensive programs, such as AI, tend to suffer challenges, primarily in programmatic risks, because it's, and we're going to operationally define that as the risks associated with not able to meet the cost, schedule, and performance goals. So this project risk is where we're operationalizing in this talk. So one of the recent mitigations that DoD has done to address this risk in AI development is to stand up the JAIC. That's the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. It's a coordinating focal point for the DoD. It only happened in the last few years. And while the JAIC has assisted in this effort, there are numerous challenges in the development in the field that continue to plague us. And two of the main ones are from the 2020 CRS report that the DoD may continue to adjust this process to account for rapidly evolving technologies such as AI. And then in a 2019 RAND report, we looked at specifically DoD AI, that it needs to adapt its acquisition approaches that are appropriate for this technology. Thus, here's our problem space that frames our research. So given the potential risk for high failures at AI system acquisitions, it is critical for the acquisition community to examine new analytical approaches to forecasting risk in the DoD acquisition of AI. And so for our purpose statement, the study examined how three methodologies, earned value management, knowledge value added, and integrated risk management can be used in conjunction to effectively address risks associated to meet these software intensive acquisition programs such as AI. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction to EVM, KVA, and IRM. So for this slide, very high level survey over three methodologies. If you have any questions about them, please put them in the chat or ask at the end of the presentations. So starting with the top left, earned value management. For the acquisition community, this is just a refresher. The DoD uses EVM within the defense acquisition system to assess risk management tool and to evaluate the progress of acquisitions. It's required by law. The FAR specifies any acquisition in excess of 20 million the program shop's required to use EVM. And so basically EVM is a system that the PMs use to integrate the program scope and to establish a baseline to monitor costs and schedule risks along the acquisition lifecycle. And then to the right column we have here is knowledge value added. KVA is an objective, quantifiable method to measure the value produced by a system and the sub-processes within that system. In essence, KVA performs a single function. It describes all processes, outputs, in common units, counts for all components, processes, and support systems necessary to complete a task or create a product or service by describing all outputs in common units. And thus, KVA allows managers to compare efficiency of the various steps across the processes within a common value reference point. And finally, on the bottom left, we have integrated risk management, IRM. IRM is a system that provides the PM and other management with the ability to analyze risk associated with the development of a new project or initiative. It combines several common accepted analytical procedures, predictive modeling, Monte Carlo simulation, real options analysis, portfolio optimization into a single comprehensive methodology. And the methodology it uses existing techniques such as discounted cash flow, return on investment, ROI, and when combined with KVA, ROK, return on knowledge, and other metrics within the analytical processes to improve the traditional manner of evaluating potential projects within the company or in the DoD. So in contrast to the other two methodologies, which are deterministic, that is, they're based off historical data such as cost or knowledge value added, IRM is probabilistic, which allows us to forecast and model risk. And so the IRM framework, it comprises of eight distinct phases of a successful and comprehensive risk analysis, which are the following. And if you notice on the diagram here on the bottom left, you'll see risk is in red on the vertical, on the y-axis, highlighted. So first you list the projects and you evaluate the strategies, and that's your risk identification phase. Then you move on to your risk prediction, where you conduct time series forecasting, you simulate that risk. And then you do some risk modeling, static modeling, and then you move into the risk analysis, and that's where you have your Monte Carlo simulation. Now, the top portion of this diagram here, those are all portions of the risk analysis. Now, the bottom part is where you go into the integrated, the risk management portion. That's on 5. You have your risk mitigation. That's where you frame the options into the decision trees. And then on the step 6, you hedge that risk. You put it out in simulations and latencies to start to optimize the risk. And then finally, you put that into the risk diversification. You put that into portfolio optimization. And the key thing about a portfolio, it's one or more projects or programs. So that's the definition. It's one or more, right? So, and then you repeat these steps 1 through 8. And 8, you report that to, you present it and you provide the analysis. If you're working with PM, you would also update your risk register as well as your risk analysis. And that's your risk management phase. And you repeat steps 1 through 8 as it's iterative as you develop and you build out more data. So IRM, if you kind of think of it as IRM is kind of the engine in a car, and then costs and some of the knowledge that comes out of KVA, EVM, that's your gasoline that runs in the car engine. And so the big takeaway about this slide, what we found, so it's a crosswalk here where we took the DoD acquisition lifecycle at the top, and then we compared that with industry at the bottom. And what we found is that there's an alignment between the DAS lifecycle and industry that allows us to map the best practices. And that 2020 GAO report that I mentioned earlier, looking at 121 acquisitions, and it highlighted the importance of addressing and responding to risk early. It called out the technology maturation risk reduction phase, the TMMR in particular, and earlier, which maps to the generic pre-investment phase. It highlighted a key point of trying to get ahead of risk early on, and then you manage it rather than trying to control it after it's gotten out of hand later on. So the proposed methodology that our research found looked at the fact that EVM remains the only program management methodology for all DoD acquisitions programs. So it's not our method isn't seeking to replace EVM; it's seeking to bolt our methodology onto it. And this is because there's significant limitations when you use EVM for AI acquisitions. The major weakness is that it's not designed for managing software-intensive acquisitions such as AI that follow an iterative path. Think about what the Admiral introduced us, talking about how in the 80s, these large-scale systems, that doesn't really jive well in the agile framework of today's development. And EVM is deterministic, and whereas when you need to do risk forecasting, you need to do probabilistic analysis. And so to remedy that shortcoming in EVM, we recommend a methodology that combines KVA, IRM, and EVM. So it's an integrated approach that supplements the EVM only with KVA and RM with these acquisitions of advanced technologies such as AI. So the example use case that where it could apply to that requirements phase that the GAO noticed. So during that requirements phase, you use EVM to establish that baseline before the acquisition of the AI. But simultaneously, the PM develops a future process model with integrated risk management that estimates the knowledge value added, incorporates the AI to set expectations that can be measured against that baseline EVM after the AI has been acquired. And this model allows it to be forecast risk early, and it's iteratives, so you can keep updating your risk register. You're controlling the risks as you're moving along the acquisition. And again, the ERM can forecast the value of options when coming to decision points and milestones. So in summary, we have the growth of AI interest It's on the rise since 2010, and there's significant project and development risks associated with AI. And while EVM remains the only program management methodology required by the DoD acquisition process, when you exceed 20 million, the major shortfall is it can't be used to forecast and get ahead of risks. Thus, PMs can integrate EVM with other methodologies such as knowledge value added and integrated risk management to supplement data for forecasting, management, and decision support. So I'd like to, last but not least, thank my co-authors. They're on the panel today, some very smart gentlemen here, Drs. Tom Housel and Jonathan Munn, and then Professor Practice Ray Jones. They were instrumental in helping us do this research. So if you have any questions or comments, please use the chat box function, or we can discuss after the final presentation. And with that, I thank you, sir, and look forward to hearing the next presentation by Professor Carol Woody.
Great, Sam. Thank you very much. Yeah, over to Dr. Carol Woody.
My name is Carol Woody, and I'm a principal researcher at the Software Engineering Institute, which is a federally funded research center under the umbrella of Carnegie Mellon University. My research is focused on building capabilities and competencies for measuring, managing, and sustaining cybersecurity for the highly complex software-intensive systems that organizations are fielding these days. In my background of software and systems engineering and program management, I have successfully implemented solutions in many domains, including banking, mining, manufacturing, government, and finance. I co-authored a book, Cybersecurity Engineering, a Practical Approach for Systems and Software Assurance, published by Pearson Education as part of the SEI series in software engineering. Along with others on my team, we have developed the CERT Cybersecurity Engineering and Software Assurance Professional Certificate, which was released on March 2018 to support the increase of expertise in this critical area of need. Understanding the needs for cybersecurity is only the start. Embedding this into practice is the next challenge. We continually see programs focusing on delivering systems that meet compliance mandates without consideration of the actual cybersecurity risk they are generating. As we move into increased speed of development and the increased reuse of third-party capabilities, the risk is increasing and programs are not taking sufficient responsibility. One of the key components for addressing this risk is an effective cybersecurity strategy. This strategy is a major supporting component for program protection planning, but too frequently the range of risks considered is woefully inadequate. Programs do not bring in the expertise needed to help identify and fully address the range of cybersecurity risk they are handling. There are many opportunities for improved consideration of cybersecurity throughout the acquisition and development lifecycle. The roles and responsibilities of cybersecurity experts include owning and leading the strategy, which should focus on removing gaps that allow unexpected and unwanted interactions among components in external systems, removing weaknesses in the design and code that make the system vulnerable, and removing opportunities for processes to bypass controls, which would allow attackers to impact mission success. There are many methods, tools, and practices that can be used by a program to address these risks. We frequently see programs selecting these options as if they were a Chinese menu, with no regard for overall goal of reducing risk. Just applying threat modeling or using security tools on code does not constitute a solid cybersecurity risk strategy. In some cases, it can actually be detrimental, since developers not knowing how to work the tools effectively can end up wasting time removing things that the tools find that are not really risks for the program. Measuring how effective each step in the life cycle is would be another area that is too often missed from a cybersecurity strategy. In addition, we see programs that do not consider their needs early enough in the life cycle and then can't retrofit what they actually need to do because they've run out of time or funding. And so they end up with poorly formed requirements, vendor contracts negotiated too early, and an inability to actually get the work done that is needed to address cybersecurity risk. A critical element for program protection is implementation of this effective strategy. There are many aspects of cybersecurity that are key to protection: trust relationships, security requirements, system resilience, and operational context. Groundwork for integrating these into a system must be laid early in the life cycle. The plan should cover how each of these aspects will be defined and addressed by the program as the system matures throughout the life cycle. Too many plans instead focus on what tools will be applied and what compliance mandates will be met. While these are useful steps, they do not ensure cybersecurity risk is addressed and do not really constitute an effective cybersecurity strategy. Good cybersecurity engineering is a must for an effective cybersecurity plan. Each program involves extensive trade-off choices among competing qualities, such as performance, reliability, safety, maintainability, and cybersecurity. Ensuring that the right balance of cybersecurity is included in this mix requires an understanding of acquisition, design, architecture, and cybersecurity risk impact. This breadth of knowledge is too frequently missing, especially in the early stages where suppliers are selected and contracts that will control decisions such as trust relationships and tasking are decided. Current training programs do not prepare system and software engineers for handling cybersecurity risk. These resources must be cross-trained for cybersecurity to be prepared to support the planning. Communication among all of the various stakeholders is equally critical. Too frequently, we see statements of work that read like each stakeholder has total control of the system with no regard for the trade-off choices that must be made. In these cases, the vendor is making the choices as they build their system, and they are focused on the bottom line, not necessarily the same concerns with cybersecurity risk. With my limited presentation time, I can only focus on one of these areas to share more detail of what should be reflected in the cybersecurity plan. So I have selected considerations of trusted dependencies in light of the recent challenges we have seen in the area of cybersecurity trust. There is more detail on each of these bullets in the paper. The growth of reuse and third-party capabilities is skyrocketing as the need to quickly field new technology solutions continues to grow. While these can provide cost and schedule savings, too many programs are adopting them without consideration about the trusted dependencies and how those impact program risk. The program needs to plan for handling inherited risk. This would be through their supply chains. This would be through their vendors, suppliers, cloud providers, other platform service providers, and anything else that's supporting the infrastructure and others like code libraries that the program will be using in development. How well they are staying current with patching, supply chain risk management for their subcontractors is a key issue in the acquisition discussion. These commitments will need to be reflected in the contracts or service level agreements set up with these different vendors when their service is acquired. Many times this is done very early in the program and these pieces are in place, ready to use when the developers come on board. But if the right relationships and the right structures are not in place, then the risk profile for what we are dealing with as we move into development and fielding cannot be guaranteed. So the cybersecurity strategy should be where you're looking at how these trust relationships are being thought about, who's involved in the decisions and the choices, to make sure that you have sufficient security through all the components and pieces that need to work together for the end system risk. The program needs to have criteria for making these appropriate choices and mechanisms in place to monitor that the vendors are delivering on what they have signed up to and continue to do so. A cybersecurity strategy is a critical planning document that should define the actions a program will perform to address cybersecurity risk throughout the life cycle. The range of potential threats is extensive, and each program must assemble knowledgeable resources to monitor and manage cybersecurity risk. Involvement of these resources should begin early in the life cycle and carry on throughout to ensure effective monitoring and response to inevitable change. Thank you for your interest in this topic, and I welcome following up.
Dr. Woody, thank you very much. Please remind everybody to put questions in the Q&A box below there, and we'll get to those at the end. So right now we're going to shift to our last speaker, Mr. Scot Miller. Scott, over to you.
So good afternoon, everyone. I just want to tell you all a good news story. Often in acquisition, I see a lot of program offices as reactive to new things. And I want to tell you this good news story about an organization that's being very proactive. First, I want to thank my co-author, Bruce Naj from Naval Aero Warfare Center and Weapons Division in China Lake for helping me put this together and inspiring me to work on it. The second point I want to make is I've spent 43 years serving the Navy, both in uniform and out of uniform. And I thought I knew all of the acronyms, but I'd never heard of NOSA, which is the Navy Ordnance Safety and Security Agency in Indian Head. They're the ones that are the good news story and are thinking ahead about this. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about system safety, which is what NOSA does, especially for ordnance. And the main point here is if I use some AI, what I would call an AI-enabled weapon, what does that mean? Well, what is that easy to do, or are there some other things we ought to think about? So we're going to down to the next slide. And what I'd like to talk to you about is you're going to see a really busy looking slide. And so the good news is that while this is part of what NOSA does, this is part of their Bill Standard 882 ECHO process, which is really not much different than a risk management framework process. We're identifying risk. So the previous two speakers just talked about risk. So this is another way to talk about risk. And you can see preliminary and functional hazard analysis. These are where we're going to determine. So, but in the second slide here, what we're talking about is a risk identification. And so normally it's normal for speakers to ask people to follow a certain level of logic. I'm going to ask you to follow a little bit more complicated set of logic, but I've written it out here. So the first thing is we're going to identify the critical software vulnerabilities, okay? And so when NOSA does that, they're going to apply what they call their level of rigor. And their level of rigor for a critical factor involves actually looking at the code. So that's all good. I think people can follow that. Here's the bad news. If you're using machine learning, AI machine learning, and you're going to review the code, yes, you can do that. No, you may not learn anything. Even if it's wrong, it may not present itself as such. Also, as I think most people understand now, that AI really is a garbage in, garbage out system. And so if we put in the wrong data, then the answers we're going to get, no matter how good the code is, are going to be incorrect. So we have to go to a different approach because frankly, there's no way to satisfy a level of rigor that requires code analysis when that doesn't actually meet the actual NOSA requirement. So is there an alternative? And that was the question that Bruce Naj and I were looking into. And so if we consider that critical function is we can equate it to an autonomous function that the AI is delivering. Well, that autonomous, I'm not a big fan of the word autonomous because it's not well defined, but I think we can use the word automation. And if we're going to use the word automation and there is a function of that particular piece of ordnance that is automated and it's driven by AI, then we should maybe check it, which means if we can reduce the level of automation of that, then maybe we can have NOSA not declared a software critical factor, but just an important factor, and then they can use other techniques and levels of rigor to check it. And so the point here really is what we'd like to do is to figure out how we can take an AI-enabled weapon and make sure that we've reduced the automation enough that we can not have it be part of the critical path. All right, so I'm going to go down to the next slide. These are just some examples of different kinds of failure modes that you could run into using AI ML. All right, so obviously we could build a system incorrectly. We can input the wrong data. We can have users that either trust it or don't trust it or trust it too much. And then of course we have cyber effects, which Dr. Woody was just talking about. So that's just an outline. There's 21, at least 21 other root causes that can be associated with these kind of things. So the question then becomes, what kind of technique can we use to figure out how to reduce that automation? And one way that we have been aware of is called interdependence analysis. Now this is developed down in Florida by the Institute for Human Machine Cognition. And their point is that unmanned systems or unmanned agents, intelligent agents and things have an interaction with people, right? So we don't want it to just be purely autonomous in that it's just operating by itself. We want it to interact and be a teammate. We think that's the best way to do it. And so how do you study that? So what we decided was we could use that analysis to inform us on how well we can reduce the automation, the autonomy of this particular AI enabled weapon. And so you can see that the interdependence analysis table is really frankly a system engineering approach where we're breaking down tasks into very specific tasks called capacities. We're going to compare how the performer, in this case maybe the agent, is conducting that function. We're going to use some color codes you'll see later, and then how the human can support them, and then also vice versa. All right. So by doing this analysis and by looking at the different color schemes, we can tell pretty quickly where there might be some issues. So let me show you an example of that. So now we're going to use an example. Now this is an unclassified scenario. It's pretty straightforward. I know it's pretty complicated and it takes a little while to read, but I'm going to break it down into three things. We've got a truck that's going to deliver 2 robots into a place. From there, because for some reason the truck can't drive any further, those 2 robots are going to navigate to their delivery area. And then the last thing we do is they have packages they're supposed to deliver. So you can just consider them as FedEx or UPS delivery people. And those robots are going to deliver that package. But they can only deliver it to a specific customer. Otherwise, it's not correct. They haven't completed their service level agreement if they don't deliver it to the right person. So they've also have a part where they have to identify that person. Okay, so that's the basic scenario. So it's pretty straightforward. Now, we're also, in this case, Bruce Naj came up with this scenario. And so he also came up with this user interface. Now, in this case, you'll see that this user interface is pretty sophisticated. So there's actually, we're not going to talk about all the details here, but it's telling us what the state of the robot is. This map shows you where it's gone. There's another picture you can bring up. So when the robot has to identify the customer, you can verify that the robot identified the correct customer, and then you can, once you verify that, then the robot will deliver the package to the customer. So there's an awful lot of thought that went into this. Now, this is because Bruce and I had worked on a previous project where we had gone through this kind of analysis with an agent that was doing planning. And so we realized that we have to be careful between the planning agent and the humans so that they can follow what's going on and make sure it makes sense. You also see here that it's easier to figure out exactly what the robot is trying to do. So that's important. So now, this is an example going back, you saw the notional interdependence analysis. This is part of an interdependence analysis for that particular scenario. So I'm not going to ask you to read it, but what I'd like to point out just is that these colors mean that these particular capacities are probably not AI related, but some of them are. And when you get to one, you need to figure out, for example, activate robots. So which particular subcomponents are involved with that? What does the truck driver do? Well, the truck driver turns on the robot, so that's important. There's another one down here, which is deliver the package. You know, the robot arms are part of the subcomponents that have to support that, but of course, there's also an identification process. And so in this case, we're making sure that we're using the GUI to make sure that a human on the loop or in the loop is involved in verifying that is the correct response. And so we use this kind of analysis not to solve, we're not necessarily solving the first question, which was how do we reduce the dependence of automation in using that weapon, but at least we're now exploring all the different elements of that decision and of that risk. So if we go to the next slide. So to summarize that, what I'm saying is if you just start in the upper left-hand corner, so that was the scenario. I'm going to conduct an IA analysis. I'm going to make sure that we either have a man in the loop or a man on the loop via the GUI that's making sure that we do those things. So if you go back to the previous two speakers, you know, Dr. Woody talked about, you know, how do we develop trust in the system? So these are ways that we do that. And also, Tim mentioned, you know, how do we evaluate risks? So here we are trying to explore all the different kinds of ways to explore the different risk factors that can occur. And so once we do that, then we've learned an awful lot of things, and then we can go back and talk to the engineers about, okay, so we're happy with this, or this does not reduce the automation enough, and so we're still going to call it a primary, or I mean a critical function, and that's a problem area. So we may have to go back and remodify the system. So in conclusion, what I really want to point out here is we found, you know, IA, it wasn't designed to be part of a test process for AI-enabled weapons. However, we found that actually was very useful. And we also believe that we can add some other columns to the IA table to help us look at some of the specific reasons that you could be a problem. The other thing is that from an engineering point of view, the interactions between humans and an agent really can be summed up in just three ways. And that was in the slide, but I forgot to mention it. But observability, that is between the robot and human; predictability, and you saw that the GUI shows the path where the robot thinks it's going, which is useful; and then directability, that is, in this case, the human could direct the robot to change its course or not deliver the package depending on the situation. And of course, in other situations, you can have robots that could, I don't want to use the word direct the human, but could certainly inform the human through warnings or alerts or recommendations. So, so I think what we've found is this interdependence analysis may be a good way for NOSA to require programs to really think through the interaction of their functions and how those can be proven to be useful and safe. And because that becomes pretty important. And of course, there's some really clever things that AI can do for us, but we need to be careful about how we apply that. We don't, you know, as I mentioned in the paper, you know, if I'm looking for a missile launcher that's kind of a pointed thing in a church steeple, which is kind of pointed, and maybe a tower on on a hospital building, which is sort of pointed 98%, confidence that it's going to pick the right thing may not be the right number. And right now, Google's pretty happy with 75% on some of their artificial intelligence tools. So we have to be very, very careful about that as we move forward. One last slide. The other thing, this slide has some comments about that we've learned more in general. A couple of them are pretty interesting. The training data sets are very, very important. I think NOSA is going to have to be involved in monitoring those. And as I've seen, in fact, Admiral, it's an ONR project, a spotter. I've observed them spending about 95% of their time maintaining and curating their data, and about 5% of the time worrying about algorithms. So, unfortunately, NOSA may end up in that business. The other thing is, how do we update those training data sets? I think we should look into what NAVWAR is doing with their DevSecOps approach and pushing things out over the air, although some of these training data sets are pretty big, so that may not work. And then the last thing was maybe from a systems engineering point of view, there's a different way we need to approach doing this kind of engineering, because it kind of requires continuous monitoring. And then if it requires continuous monitoring, then from a NOSA point of view, they're not set up to do continuous evaluation. So there's some questions there that we'll have to grapple with in the future. But to their credit, I'm very impressed with that NOSA has been thinking about this before any real products come out that the Navy's going to be using. So that concludes my remarks, and I'm standing by for questions with the rest of the presenters.
Wow, hey Scott, thank you very much. That's really interesting discussion. It's so NOSA used to be mine. I was the chief engineer at NAVC CO5, so NOSA was under me. So I started this thing a couple years ago called the Digital Engineering Blueprint, really trying to get us on the digital engineering drumbeat. And I pulled Dale Sisson and I said, Dale, you got to get ahead of this, because these weapon systems, as we go into this world of AI and automation, we got to change the way we conduct the WESR, the Weapon System Explosive Safety Review Board. And so Dale, and I think Eric Hawley is one of his really smart guys, a bunch of others, got engaged. And I haven't been plugged in for a year, so I'm glad to see this is still continuing and you're helping them out. So that's fantastic. Okay, so if you got questions out there, please put them in. I have seen a couple come in, and I see there have been some attempts to answer some of these. But one question came in, I just want to kick to the whole group here. Is there an AI arms race taking place between the U.S. and China? What do you guys anybody, what are your thoughts on that? Scott's nodding up and down. Yeah.
I'll go ahead and take that, sir, since I answered it in the chat box.
Yeah.
So this is along the field of the discussion, and this was actually my studies at War College last year. It was really focusing in on this. So you got the great power competition. That's without without debate. But within the field of international relations and those theorists who are involved in that, there's some comparisons. There's the whole aspect of comparing the Cold War, so to speak, and then looking at like the futures, like you talked about, with whether we're pacing China, whether they're passing us up. Russia looking at some of these weapon systems, these doomsday systems, so to speak. So that's just, the literature is just fraught with debate now, and you can argue either direction. But regardless, we are definitely in great power competition, and it behooves us to get ahead where we can and make the investments.
Yeah, no, thanks, Tim. Carol, go ahead.
I'd like to add that no matter what, we're trying to reduce the costs and speed the delivery. And so anything that we think helps us, even though it may not get the fidelity that we're hoping for, is considered a plus, because face it, we're relying on technology and the cost is very high. And we'd like to spend that money on other things. So the lowest cost, best solution is what we're going for. And AI is definitely a good tool to help us there.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. Just so, actually, you just said something about the speed of delivery is important. We got to get faster. So I started, and I think you were having some technical difficulties getting in, but I started by
quite a challenge.
Yeah, no, we had trouble too. I got it. But what am I talking about? I think our acquisition system is tuned for the Cold War. And it's still kind of, it still has vestiges of that, where we are going against a Soviet threat who was really economically inferior to us and technologically inferior to us. They were, there were a couple areas they were good at, but for the most part, we were racing ahead. Today's a different world, different mindset. What does the group think about, to adopt some of these technologies we're talking about, whether it's cybersecurity issues or AI or even other tech that's coming along? What are your thoughts about the way we're organized today, and thoughts on maybe kind of what we need to try to do differently? Over to you guys.
The term I keep coming up with is stovepipes of excellence.
Mhm.
And that's where we are continually running into coordination problems and continually running into people doing things in small focused areas that don't fit the big picture. I think that's going to be a struggle for us no matter what, because all these systems are interconnected now.
Yeah.
I can comment on that.
Yes.
Yeah, the whole 5000 series set up to eliminate risk. That's an engineer's dream. That's nice. It doesn't. When it comes to acquiring these kinds of technologies, you must accept failure as a possibility. There is a volatility there in developing these kinds of immature technologies. So if there's no acceptance of failure as a standard practice for immature technology like this, and it's not that way in the DoD, because the admiral now has to go up and defend to Congress that the big program failed. And if you don't have some kind of a capital fund internally that allows you to deal with these kinds of things, I'm not very hopeful, and the 5000 series won't help you with that.
Yeah. So Tom, one point. So to your point there, the acquisition programs we have today, especially the multi-billion-dollar ones, they're not incentivized to really take these new technologies because there's a lot of risk, right? It's going to impact cost, schedule, those kind of things. So I was actually on a panel yesterday that AFRL sponsored, and it was John Wilson from Army, Heather Pringle from Air Force, myself, and we were talking about the value of death, and we were trying to describe it. So John Wilson, the Army guy, he said this. He said, "Admiral, it's not a valley of death. It's actually a moat that's dug intentionally by the PO around itself that he fills with alligators. So you and your S&T can't get in because you're a threat to them, because it will just muck with their model. They're all about incremental changes, right? But that's not the world today. The world today is about, it's about freaking transforming, disruptive changes, what I call Horizon 3 changes. That's where we need to be going, not Horizon 1 incremental. And the system is not incentivized to value that, and that's a part of the problem.
I would just add to what you just said a little bit, maybe slightly different direction with regard to the Chinese. They are making huge, gigantic investments in higher education, PhD levels. At my old department at U.S. University of Southern California, most of the department now is Chinese. We're Chinese professors. They come here because they get paid better and there's more freedom and so on and so forth. But they are not going to be stealing our IP for, they're creating their own IP, their own intellectual property.
Yeah. So I'm a naval STEM executive, and we have got a tremendous national security challenge with STEM talent in this country. We are not creating enough STEM students that might be able to get cleared in DoD and other places. It's a tremendous challenge for us, but China is, so we got to get after that.
Yeah, but just to push back a little bit on this whole STEM thing, that's you may be right about that in terms of number of engineers and so on, but the engineers that worked for me when I was an executive at Telecom Italia were Italian, and they had a really good liberal arts background, and in addition to their engineering, and they were better problem solvers than my higher educated guys at AT&T, known as Pacific Bell.
They're using both sides of their brain. Carol,
I'd like to raise an issue around basic engineering training, because most engineers are taught to decompose a problem. And yet what we are dealing with is that we have to look at, especially in the area of cybersecurity, the synergies. And we have to look at the broader strategic pictures. And we find that the decomposition mindset is getting in the way. And people don't understand that they have to embrace the complexity. and they have to really think through it and plan for it. We don't have that mindset on the problem space. We actually need both. You need the details at the bottom, but you've got to have that big picture as well.
Totally agree.
Great point. Do Tim, do you have any thoughts on any of these comments, or Scott?
Yes, sir. Yeah. So just, I mean, it's in the AI webinar a couple months ago, I talked about how we didn't get to these problems overnight, and we're not going to change them overnight. There's an organizational culture change that we got to go after. And you hit it at Tom did, so did Carol, just going after our process and procedures. We're making the right steps. There's in the DoD, there's Platform 1 that's using DevSecOps, Spiral, quick iterative development, agile framework, as well as the Air Force's Kessel Run. So there's, and then Defense Innovation Unit's also going after letting the commercial sector take ownership of that risk by using dual use technology. So there's great ideas that are going after it, but we just got to keep hitting this from across the board, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Scott, any thoughts?
Well, so I'd like to push back a little bit on some of those things, because until we can actually develop good software code, I think we're just accelerating the amount of bad software we're putting out there and making it even worse for the users. But that's a different discussion. But I think once we can get good software, then yes, we should be pursuing that more frequently. On the AI side, I agree with you, Tim. There's some cultural issues on data. So we're really not going to do any of this AI until we start getting a real handle on data. And we've made several attempts in the DoD over the last 25 years to do that. And we've frankly generally failed miserably. And a lot of that is not technical, it's completely cultural. The fact that people even consider that they're data owners is beyond me. I think the only data owner are taxpayers. We're stewards of the data. We should be, frankly, many of us should probably be in jail for the way we've been stewards of our data. You know, we have people just wasting data because they don't have any place to put it. So we've got, but unfortunately, that's going to hurt our ability to do a lot of this AI machine learning things. And so that's just some of the other challenges we face. I just spent yesterday at NAVWAR though, and I will tell you there's some positive things happening there. So I was happy to see that.
So Admiral, I don't know if you're familiar with InQtel, if it still exists. It was CIA's version of being a VC, and it was, you know, at least they were trying to get around this cumbersome acquisition set up not for these kinds of technologies, you know, and they were probably not that successful, but still constrained by the rules and that sort of thing. But it was the right idea. They were going in the right direction, but I just don't see anything else happening that way.
Yeah, got it. Here's a question that just came in. How do you ensure the human monitoring of AI has better judgment than the AI when they may not have been paying attention, may get blindsided by a suddenly emerging crisis? Scott, I think that's maybe over you, but I mean, I guess that's about your data, your training data. That's a big part of this. How do you know you even have that right?
So there's still, I mean, we still have systems. They still require to educate and train users. There's still a trust development process here. There's some other aspects I didn't go into on interdependence analysis, which allow us to break that down such that we try to avoid such situations. But I don't think you're ever going to completely avoid those kind of situations. For example, even in our case, where we're identifying the customer, you know, we're going to give the user, you know, a second to figure out that that's the right person and they can push a button. We try to make it as simple as possible. We try to reduce it down to the minimum elements that they need to make a decision. So, and so some of that's hard, and there's going to be some really hard engineering required to create teams between agents and humans or unmanned systems and humans. But I do think that there's I think our country is more willing to try that than some other peer competitors, and it lets us as Americans use our ingenuity and initiative in ways that are better than I think our competitors.
Yeah,
Let me
Go ahead,
pose a challenge that I've seen, and this is in the cybersecurity side. You folks talk about data and using data, but in reality, programs don't share their data around cybersecurity. Nobody does. And so we end up with a lack of the data to draw on to begin to apply AI to make good decisions, because you're only able to get one small pocket of data around a specific program or a specific technology. I would applaud safety in that I think they've done a much better job of data sharing so that we can improve everybody's capabilities by knowing more about what the details are. But on the security side, the minute something happens, we clamp down on it and hide the data. That's not going to do any of us any good. So ultimately, we need to look at not only data we've got access to, but how can we improve that data so that over time we can improve our capabilities.
Yeah, so you mentioned, I think Tim mentioned Kessel Run and some of these other DevSecOps pilots we've got going on. IDBS, the POIDBS has got some. We're doing some stuff with Overmatch. We've got some in ONR that we're doing. And I think there's goodness in all these. I struggle with trying to figure out how does that scale? And that's where, you know, your thoughts on that. I mean, because here you got these little one-offs doing great work. I got it. But then how do you take this and how does this scale to the broader ecosystem of acquisition we're doing across DoD? Who wants to tackle that one?
I think some of it boils down to how you're defining the requirements of what you need to have. And too frequently, the requirements are defined around the technology and not around the business problem or the program problem that you're actually trying to solve. I think if we can do a better job of defining our needs and not define them in terms of certain standards or certain other mechanical activities or certain pieces of technology, then we can better see how those solutions can be tailored to other needs.
And I'm really glad you said that, Carol, because that's exactly where my head's been at for the last several months. I've been thinking about this because we tend to go right to the requirements, and it's always based on kind of what we already know. And so what you get is for the next ship, it's another gray thing, and it looks just like the last thing, but it's a little bigger, it's more power, and it has more weapons. But we're not really looking beyond that, and we need the problem and really define the problem and work it with the fleet and with the users and everybody, get that crisply defined, and then go curate solutions that might solve the problem. We tend to go right to the answer. So I think Carol,
couldn't agree with you more, Admiral. Well, what I teach is process reengineering. So when we look at a problem, we start with the problem, as Carol was saying. We don't start with the technology. And by the way, an F-35 sitting on the ground is a hunk of metal. It costs me money. It's useless. Okay. So it's these processes, these warfighting processes that we need to model, and we need to get the base case. You don't start changing things till you know where you're at. So you need a baseline. So when we get our baseline metrics, we use KVA for that, and IRM we use for forecasting. But when we get the base case, then we say, all right, now how are we going to incrementally improve this, because that's going to happen. You know, there's an optimization that can happen. But then how are we going to radically improve this? And that's where you got to get really creative. And that's where those maybe non-STEM skills come in with the strategy issues that Carol was talking about. So that's how we do it. We don't do it from the technology back, as Carol was saying. You know, we do it from the process and what's going to change. What good is it going to do? And then Jonathan will take those options, because there's a variety of options that are possible, and value those options in the context of risk. And it's not just structural risk. It's a more quantitative risk, like you would find in the stock market. It's volatility. And so you need that data to be able to do that. That's what we do.
Yes, I've had some fascinating conversation in the last couple months with Steve Blank, Lean Startup Steve Blank, and just the same idea. Get that problem defined first. Go from the problem and then work your way out. So I'm about to on an effort. We're going to go do a little project to go prove a different way of setting requirements, without setting them up front, and see kind of where that goes. And then see how that potentially can scale to other things as well. Again, I think we're in need of a structural reform. It's not an acquisition reform. It's a structural change that has to happen. And it may involve existing parts of our current system, but rearrange them in different organizational constructs. Because I think unless you do that, the culture will eat you for lunch. I mean, it's going to eat you. You got to restructure to kind of overcome some of that. And you got to have a powerful vision to drive the entire workforce in the right direction.
A lot of what you're talking about, Admiral's above my pay grade. It's you're talking about folks like yourself that had to deal with those political. There's the politics of numbers, and then there's the objective use of the numbers. The other thing that we do when we're doing, how can we fix this? How can we improve this process? We want to do demonstration level prototypes, right? So it's just a PowerPoint maybe with some buttons and buttonology. And then when we get, then that's how we start to derive requirements. We did this when we were at Pacific Bell on building expert systems. And then the next thing that we do is we build a working prototype. It's going to be a little buggy, but we can do some use cases so you can see, because we found that the users don't know what they want until they see it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Something to call from Moonshine calls it predotype. Do a predotype before you do a prototype, and make it out of like paper. I mean, something just really simple that you can kind of contextualize and maybe even touch and feel, and bring a warfighter to look at it, and then go spend a little more money to prototype, and again get the warfighters engaged. And that it opens up the thinking, and bringing the left and right brain people together, and they just have those kind of discussions and see what comes out of it. So, all right, got it. All right, any last thoughts from any of my panelists on any big things you want to convey to your audience?
I had just one or two quick thoughts, Admiral.
Yeah.
First, I'd like to see, for example, the Chief of Naval Operations just recently cited that he wants Admiral Small to lead this overmatch thing, and then he cited some fairly famous naval officers. And what was striking to me is the people he cited, Admiral Rickover, et cetera, they served in the same job for a long time. So I wonder if Admiral Small will be asked to serve running overmatch for a long time. I think he'll have a much better chance of succeeding if he's allowed to do that. That's one thought I just leave the crowd with. And then the second one was you asked about how to do some of the Kessel Run and how do I scale that. I'm not sure if this is exactly related to it, but I've been looking into formal model-based system engineering methods. That is where we're using models to produce workable code. There's a lot of virtuous circles that start occurring when you start thinking that way. And so I'm anxious to see what the Navy already has a digital system engineering transformation working group. So I'm interested to see if we get that far.
Yeah, no, interesting. Tenure, I think you're absolutely right. Naval Rec was 8 years. SSP, Johnny Wolf, 6 years, right? Nuclear weapons, nuclear propulsion. Yeah, obviously very important to get that right. The reality is, it takes a good year, maybe even 2, to really wrap your head around the complexity of what both of those organizations are dealing with. And so by then, in a standard timeline, you'd either be rolling or maybe you get to 3 years and you go. I was at Cheng for 4 years, and I told everybody, I said, I think you've got to go at least 4 years to be effective in a job like that. It's too complex. Doug Smalls is the same thing. I don't know where that's going to go. Don't know where it's going to go. We'll see. Hey, another question came in for Carol here. Dr. Woody, DoD and industry and CMMC. Could you please chat a little more about training and certification that you mentioned?
We've got a certification that is focused on exposing people to the range of challenges they need to tackle within cybersecurity. We find too frequently everybody has a little stovepipe and not a big understanding of what they need. And so we've assembled a an online training. You can go to the SEI website and look up certification and be able to find the one on cybersecurity engineering and software assurance. The platform is set up to give you remote access for a lengthy period of time so that you can get that exposure and get that understanding, because we're trying to build these big thinkers that have the broader perspective to understand the challenges. Along those lines, I'd like to point out that no matter where you are in the organization or what you're doing, you've got data and you probably have some responsibility around cybersecurity. Just monitoring what you're doing now and figuring out where it's insufficient and reaching out to others that you know care about the same kind of problem can start this collaboration. And it's really sharing information and sharing understanding. We started an informal working group around folks in our organization who were all working on DevSecOps, and basically just started sharing our information about what we were learning and to raise all the boats, so to speak. So everybody understood a little bit more. And we came out of that with some key research areas that we are now launching into. And it's because no one of us would have seen the problem. We had to put all our information together. So I would emphasize collaboration is going to be key to us solving these problems.
Yeah, that goes after kind of the General Stanley McChrystal team of teams concept. You got to figure out how to not only folks, smart people, smart groups together and have a constant dialogue. That's how you solve these complex problems.
And you can do that at any level in the organization.
Absolutely. In fact, and sometimes the more informal it is, the better at a lower level. You can do it formally, but sometimes that informal network is even more powerful.
Exactly.
Closing thoughts. I think we got like a minute and a half. We're going to get cut off here, but Tim, you got any thoughts?
No, sir. I think the distinguished panel, I mean, a very smart group. They answered all the questions, and then just piggyback the point on team of teams from General McChrystal, you know, getting to a learning organization. I think if we strive for that, yeah, we're gonna help solve some of these wicked problems. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, got it. And how about Tom? You got any last thoughts, sir?
I would just make a simple request of the folks that work in the Pentagon. It took us about a year, and not in Tim's case, but in a different retired colonel's case who came from the Pentagon straight to us in a PhD program. And it took us a year to get him out of drawing clouds and arrows, and then a miracle happens. You know, a bit at some point when there's a bit more precise definition of the problem. That's if we can just define the problem clearly, and you tell us what your goals, your purpose is. It helps us help you, and that's what Naval Postgraduate School is for. It's to help the Navy, and that's what we want to do all the time.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's all about that problem. Hey, team, a great panelists. Thank you all very much for your expertise. It's been a great discussion. Audience today, thank you very much for tuning in to listen to us and to provide your comments and questions. Hopefully this answered some, but hopefully also open some maybe some thoughts in your minds about thinking about different ways of doing business, because we need to think about that. It's time, folks. It really is. With that, I think we're going to close it out. So please check the symposium program for the link to the next scheduled event. And with that, I want to thank you all and have a great rest of your day out here.
Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Admiral.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Bye.